Woke cop harasses Clint Eastwood at airport. Minutes later, his career is over. The Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with its usual chaotic symphony of announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried footsteps. Clint Eastwood, the legendary Tati, actor and filmmaker, made his way through the terminal with the measured pace of someone who had seen enough of life to know that rushing rarely solved anything. He had just landed from a 5-hour flight from Dallas, his characteristic attire and commanding presence drawing subtle glances from fellow travelers who tried and failed to appear casual in their recognition. The baggage claim area was particularly crowded that afternoon, filled with passengers from several recently arrived flights. As Clint stood waiting for his luggage, he observed the scene around him with the keen eye of a director who had spent decades capturing human nature on film. Young families corralled excited children, business people checked their phones impatiently, and airport staff moved with practiced efficiency through the organized chaos. It was then that Officer James Sullivan, known among his colleagues for his progressive approach to law enforcement, approached. Sullivan represented a new wave of police officers who believed in reforming traditional security protocols to be more inclusive and empathetic. His uniform was impeccable, but it was his gentle demeanor that set him apart from the typically stern airport security personnel. "Good afternoon, sir," Sullivan addressed Clint with a respectful yet firm tone. "Would you mind presenting your identification? We're conducting a new security procedure designed to ensure equal treatment for all passengers." The request caught Clint's attention, not because it was unusual to be asked for identification in an airport, but because of the officer's distinctive approach. He raised an eyebrow, his weathered features forming an expression that had become iconic in countless films. "Equal treatment? We're all just waiting for our bags here, aren't we?" The interaction quickly drew the attention of nearby passengers, many of whom recognized the legendary filmmaker. Among them was Sarah Martinez, an investigative journalist known for her insightful coverage of social reform and civil rights. She had been working on a series about the modernization of security protocols and their impact on civil liberties. Sensing a story unfolding before her, she moved closer, her camera ready but discreet. Officer Sullivan maintained his professional composure as he explained, "This is part of our new initiative to prevent any form of discrimination while maintaining security standards. We're working to create a more inclusive environment for all travelers." Clint's response was measured but pointed, reflecting decades of experience in both filmmaking and human interaction. "I appreciate the intention, but wouldn't true equality mean not singling anyone out unless there's a specific reason?" The philosophical undertone of his question wasn't lost on Sarah Martinez, who had now positioned herself within earshot, her journalistic instincts telling her that this encounter represented something larger than a simple security check. It was a microcosm of the broader societal debate about tradition versus progress. The tension in the air was palpable as other passengers began to take notice, some discreetly recording the interaction on their phones. The scene had all the elements of a compelling story, a beloved cultural icon known for his traditional values, a progressive officer trying to implement new protocols, and a journalist capturing every nuance of their exchange. "Mr. Eastwood," Officer Sullivan continued, his voice remaining steady, "I understand your perspective, but sometimes change requires us to question even our most basic assumptions about how things should be done." The response sparked something in Clint's eyes, not anger, but rather a genuine interest in the young officer's conviction. Despite his reputation for portraying tough, uncompromising characters, Clint had always been a thoughtful observer of human nature and social evolution. Sarah Martinez watched as the two men, representing different generations and perspectives, engaged in what was becoming less of a confrontation and more of a dialogue. Her trained eye noticed how their body language shifted, how the initial tension began to give way to something more nuanced. The baggage claim carousel continued its relentless rotation behind them, but the luggage had become secondary to the impromptu forum on social progress that was unfolding. Other travelers had formed a loose circle around the scene, drawn not by conflict, but by the unexpected depth of the exchange between these two contrasting figures. As the conversation progressed, it became clear that this chance encounter was a key developing into something more significant, a moment that would spark discussions about the balance between security and dignity, tradition and progress in an ever-changing world. The scene they were creating would soon become more than just another airport security check. It would become a catalyst for a larger examination of how society navigates the delicate path between preserving what works and embracing necessary change. Sarah Martinez sat in her favorite coffee shop near the airport, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard as she crafted the opening paragraphs of what she knew would be a compelling story. The encounter she had witnessed between Clint Eastwood and Officer Sullivan had evolved into something far more intriguing than a simple security check. It had become a symbol of the ongoing dialogue between traditional values and progressive reform. Her phone buzzed with notifications as clips of the airport interaction began circulating on social media. The public's reaction was immediate and divided, with some praising Officer Sullivan's commitment to modern policing methods, while others defended Eastwood's questioning of overzealous security measures. But Sarah knew there was a deeper story here, one that transcended the simple narrative of old versus new. As she reviewed her notes, the coffee shop's door chimed, and to her surprise, Officer Sullivan walked in. He looked different now, more relaxed in civilian clothes, though he carried himself with the same mindful presence she had observed at the airport. Sarah hesitated for a moment before deciding to approach him. "Officer Sullivan, I'm Sarah Martinez. I was at the airport earlier." "The journalist?" He nodded, recognition crossing his features. "I saw you taking notes. I suppose this will be quite a story." "Actually, I was hoping to get your perspective," Sarah replied, gesturing to the empty chair at her table. "There's more to this than just an airport security check, isn't there?" Sullivan sat down, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when I joined the force, I had this idea that we could change everything overnight, make everything fair, perfect, inclusive. But what happened today with Mr. Eastwood, it made me think about something else." Their conversation was interrupted by another familiar figure entering the coffee shop. Clint Eastwood himself walked in, his presence commanding the same quiet attention it had at the airport. He had come to meet with the airport security director about the earlier incident, and the coffee shop happened to be their chosen meeting point. The coincidence was too perfect for Sarah to ignore. With careful respect, she approached Clint, introducing herself and explaining her interest in the story. To her surprise, he agreed to join their table, creating an unexpected reunion of the morning's principal characters. "You know," Clint began, settling into his chair with the ease of someone used to being in the spotlight, "I've been thinking about our discussion at the airport. Reminds me of something I learned in filmmaking. Sometimes the best shot isn't the one you planned, but the one that develops naturally." Officer Sullivan leaned forward, intrigued. "How so?" "Well," Clint continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "In my early days, everything was about following the traditional rules of filmmaking. But as times changed, we had to adapt. The trick wasn't throwing out everything we knew, it was finding ways to blend the old with the new." Sarah's recorder captured every word as the conversation deepened. The three of them, the iconic filmmaker, the progressive officer, and the investigative journalist, engaged in a discussion that went far beyond the morning's events. They talked about the challenges of implementing change while preserving valuable traditions, the importance of listening to different perspectives, and the art of finding common ground. As their discussion continued, other patrons in the coffee shop tried to appear casual while straining to hear the conversation. The scene was almost cinematic, afternoon light streaming through the windows, the buzz of coffee grinders providing a subtle backdrop, and three individuals from different worlds finding unexpected connection in their shared experience. Officer Sullivan shared his vision for modern policing, explaining how his progressive approach wasn't about dismissing traditional methods, but about enhancing them with new understanding. "It's like adding new tools to the toolbox," he explained, "not throwing the old ones away." Clint nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "That reminds me of when we first started using digital cameras in filmmaking. Many thought it would be the end of traditional cinematography. Instead, it opened up new possibilities while preserving the fundamental art of storytelling. Sarah watched the interaction with growing fascination. What had started as a potential story about conflict was transforming into something far more nuanced, a tale about the delicate balance between preservation and progress, about finding harmony between different generations and viewpoints. The story of the airport encounter spread rapidly across social media platforms, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of the usual polarized reactions, the video clips sparked thoughtful discussions about the nature of progress and tradition. Sarah Martinez's initial article, published in the Los Angeles Times, had captured the nuanced dialogue that emerged from that chance meeting, and it resonated deeply with readers across the political spectrum. A week after the incident, Clint found himself sitting in his office at his production company, reviewing a proposal that had arrived that morning. Officer Sullivan had reached out through proper channels, suggesting a collaboration that seemed almost too perfectly timed. A documentary series about the evolution of law enforcement, examining how traditional methods and progressive approaches could work in harmony. The proposal sat open on his desk as he gazed out at the California sunshine. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Martinez, who had been keeping in touch since their coffee shop conversation. "Have you seen the impact statistics from the article? People are actually talking to each other instead of at each other. Your conversation with Sullivan sparked something bigger than we imagined." As if on cue, his assistant announced an unexpected visitor. Officer Sullivan himself, in his civilian clothes, looking slightly nervous but determined. Clint welcomed him in, noting how different the young man appeared outside of his uniform, more vulnerable perhaps, but no less committed to his ideals. "Mr. Eastwood," Sullivan began, settling into a chair, "I know this might seem presumptuous, but after our discussion last week, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said about storytelling and change. The way you talked about adapting while preserving what matters most. It's exactly what we're trying to do in law enforcement." Clint leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me more about this documentary idea of yours, but first, let's get some coffee. Can't have a proper discussion without it." He pressed the intercom, requesting beverages, and noticed how Sullivan relaxed slightly at this simple gesture of hospitality. As they talked, Sarah Martinez was across town, interviewing other officers who had begun implementing Sullivan's progressive approaches. She discovered a pattern emerging. Those who initially resisted the changes were starting to see the value in combining traditional experience with new methodologies. Her recorder captured story after story of veteran officers mentoring younger ones while learning from their fresh perspectives. "It's not about throwing away what we know works," one senior officer told her. "It's about adding new tools to our belt. Just like Eastwood said in that coffee shop. You don't abandon the fundamentals of storytelling just because you've got new technology." Back in Clint's office, the discussion had deepened. Sullivan shared his vision for the documentary series. Not a criticism of traditional methods, but an exploration of how law enforcement could evolve while honoring its core mission of protecting and serving the community. "The thing is," Sullivan explained, warming to his subject, "every time I watch one of your films, I see how you've adapted to new techniques while keeping the soul of storytelling intact. That's what we're trying to do with modern policing. Keep the core values while adapting to a changing world." Clint's interest was clearly piqued. He pulled out a yellow legal pad, old habits die hard, and began taking notes. "You know," he said, "when I first started directing, old-timers told me I was doing it all wrong, but some of them also shared their wisdom, taught me things no film school ever could. The trick was learning to listen to both the past and the future." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office as they continued their discussion. Sarah arrived later, having been invited to join them, her journalist's instincts telling her that she was witnessing something significant. The three of them spent hours outlining possibilities, each bringing their unique perspective to the table. "The key," Clint said at one point, "is showing that progress doesn't have to mean rejection of the past. It's about building bridges, not walls." He paused, looking at both Sullivan and Sarah. Maybe that's what this whole thing has been about from the start, finding ways to connect different worldviews instead of forcing them apart. As the day drew to a close, they had the beginnings of not just a documentary series, but a broader initiative. Sullivan's progressive policing methods would be examined alongside traditional approaches, with real officers from both perspectives sharing their experiences. Clint's production company would ensure the story was told with the respect and nuance it deserved, while Sarah's investigative skills would add depth and context to the narrative. As production on the documentary series began, unexpected connections emerged that none of them had anticipated. Sarah's research uncovered a surprising link. Officer Sullivan's grandfather had been a police officer in the 1960s, serving during some of the most turbulent times in American history. More surprisingly still, he had been an extra in one of Clint's earliest films, a fact that Sullivan had never known. The discovery added another layer to their project. Sullivan brought in his grandfather's old police journal, its pages filled with reflections on law enforcement that seemed startlingly relevant to modern discussions. Clint was particularly moved by one entry that spoke about the importance of maintaining humanity in the face of procedural changes. "Your grandfather understood something fundamental," Clint told Sullivan one afternoon during filming. "He wrote about how every new procedure, every new rule had to be filtered through the lens of human dignity. Sounds a lot like what you're trying to do now." Sarah, who had become an integral part of the project, found herself researching the evolution of police training methods. She discovered a pattern of recurring debates between tradition and progress, each generation facing its own version of the same essential questions. Her articles about the documentary's development were gaining national attention, sparking conversations in police departments across the country. One morning, during a break in filming, Sullivan arrived at the studio looking troubled. "I found something else in my grandfather's things," he said, pulling out an old photograph. It showed a group of officers from different backgrounds, standing together despite the segregation of the era. He was part of a progressive movement back then too, they just didn't call it that. The photograph became a powerful symbol in their documentary. Clint saw in it the same spirit he had witnessed in the airport, people trying to bridge divides, to find common ground in uncommon times. They decided to make it the centerpiece of one episode, exploring how each generation's definition of progress built upon the humanitarian efforts of those who came before. As they delved deeper into the project, Sarah's investigative skills revealed more connections between past and present reform movements. She discovered that the airport's current security protocols had evolved from a combination of traditional security wisdom and modern sensitivity training, a blend that echoed their ongoing discussions about balancing old and new approaches. The production team captured candid moments between veteran officers and new recruits, showing how wisdom could flow in both directions. Young officers shared insights about community engagement through social media, while seasoned veterans taught nuances of human interaction that no training manual could capture. Clint found himself particularly drawn to these unscripted moments. "This is where the real story lives," he told Sarah during one filming session. "In the small moments where people forget their differences and just connect as human beings." The documentary series was taking shape, but it was becoming clear that it was about more than just law enforcement. It was a story about American identity itself, how institutions could preserve their core values while adapting to changing times, how different generations could learn from each other without sacrificing their principles. One afternoon, they filmed a scene that captured the essence of their project. Sullivan and his grandfather's old partner, now retired, sat together reviewing modern police training materials. The older man pointed out how certain fundamental principles remained unchanged, while Sullivan demonstrated how new approaches built upon these foundations. "You know what your grandfather used to say," the retired officer told Sullivan, his eyes twinkling with memory. "He said that good policing is like good filmmaking. It's all about seeing the humanity in every scene." The parallel wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Clint, who had been watching the exchange, nodded in quiet appreciation. He recognized in these conversations the same delicate balance he had spent his career trying to maintain, honoring tradition while embracing necessary change. Sarah's. Articles about the project continued to draw attention, but now they were being picked up by police training academies as discussion materials. The story of how an airport security check had evolved into a meaningful dialogue about progress and tradition was inspiring similar conversations across the country. 6 months after the chance encounter at LAX, the Los Angeles International Airport's main terminal was once again the center of attention. This time, however, it wasn't because of a security check, but rather the premiere screening of the final episode of Bridging the Divide, the documentary series that had grown from that fateful meeting between Clint Eastwood and Officer Sullivan. The airport had transformed its largest waiting area into an impromptu theater, with screens showing the documentary to a diverse audience of law enforcement officers, airport staff, journalists, and travelers who found themselves unexpectedly part of this historic moment. Sarah Martinez moved through the crowd, no longer just observing, but now an integral part of the story she had helped tell. The final episode began with the original footage from that day, the interaction that had started it all. But now, viewed through the lens of everything that had followed, the scene carried new meaning. What had initially appeared as a confrontation between old and new was revealed as the catalyst for a profound dialogue about change and continuity in American institutions. "It's strange watching it now," Officer Sullivan said to Clint as they stood at the back of the crowd. "That morning I thought I was just doing my job, trying to implement new procedures. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Clint's response carried the weight of decades of storytelling experience. The best stories often start that way, with a simple moment that opens up into something much bigger than ourselves. The documentary had indeed become something bigger. Police academies across the country had begun incorporating segments from the series into their training programs. The blend of traditional wisdom and progressive approaches that Clint and Sullivan had explored was inspiring a new wave of law enforcement reform that respected both the past and the future. Sarah's series of articles accompanying the documentary had won her a prestigious journalism award, but more importantly, they had helped change the national conversation about police reform. Her latest piece, The Bridge Builders, highlighted how departments nationwide were finding their own ways to balance tradition with progress. As the final episode played, the camera lingered on a scene that had become iconic. Sullivan and Clint sitting with Sullivan's grandfather's old partner, poring over both the yellowed pages of decades-old police manuals and modern training, materials on tablets, finding parallel wisdom across generations. The airport audience watched in respectful silence as the documentary concluded with a sequence of interviews with officers from different eras, each sharing how their perspectives had evolved through this project. The final shot, carefully crafted under Clint's direction, showed the same baggage claim area where it had all begun, but now with officers and travelers interacting with a new awareness and mutual respect. After the screening, as the crowd mingled and discussed what they'd seen, the airport security director approached the trio, Clint, Sullivan, and Sarah. "You know," he said, "when I first heard about what happened that day, I worried it would become another viral moment of conflict. Instead, it became a template for how we can actually talk to each other about difficult changes." Sullivan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "My grandfather wrote in his journal that the hardest part of being a good officer wasn't learning new procedures. It was learning how to help people feel safe and respected while following them. I think that's still true today." Sarah, who had been taking notes even now, couldn't help but observe how the dynamic between Clint and Sullivan had evolved. What had begun as an awkward encounter between opposing viewpoints had transformed into a genuine partnership, each man's perspective enriched by the other's experience. The impact of their collaboration extended beyond the documentary itself. The airport had implemented a new training program, developed with input from both Sullivan's progressive initiatives and traditional security expertise. Officers were learning to combine time-tested observation skills with modern sensitivity training, creating an approach that was both effective and respectful. As the evening drew to a close, Clint found himself back at the same spot where he had first met Sullivan. The baggage claim carousel still moved in its endless loop, but something had changed. The space felt different now, not because of any physical alterations, but because of the new understanding that had been forged here. "You know what I've learned from all this," he said to Sullivan and Sarah as they prepared to leave. "Sometimes what looks like opposition is really just two parts of the same truth trying to find each other." The airport's evening announcements echoed through the terminal, mixing with the conversations of travelers and the steady hum of machinery. In this familiar chaos, something new had taken root, a demonstration of how progress and tradition could not just coexist, but strengthen each other. As they walked toward the exit, Sarah captured one final quote for her epilogue. "The real story," Clint said, his voice carrying its characteristic gravelly wisdom, "wasn't about changing procedures or implementing new policies. It was about remembering that beneath all our different approaches, we're all just trying to make things a little better than we found them." The automatic doors slid open to the warm Los Angeles evening, and the three of them stepped out into a world that, while still full of challenges, seemed a little more hopeful than it had been 6 months ago. Their story had shown that change didn't have to mean abandoning tradition, and tradition didn't have to resist progress. Sometimes all it took was the willingness to listen, learn, and find the common ground that had been there all along.